Hi, and welcome to our first podcast of European Food and Drink, marketing our new report, which covers the European food and drink packaging market. I'm joined with the author of the report, Jonathan Thomas. Jonathan, if you could give us a brief introduction to your background, that'd be great.
Hi, well, I've been in the market information industry pretty much since 1993 when I graduated from university. Firstly, I worked for market information publisher Keynote for about 8 years. And then after that, I was doing a similar role in the food and drink industry for Leatherhead Food, putting together market reports, giving presentations, editing bulletins, that sort of thing. And now I'm a freelance market analyst consultant. Been working for Smithers now for about 7 or 8 years by my reckoning. And packaging is one of the areas in which I've been doing reports for them.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So today we're going to discuss sort of the high level trends that we're seeing in the food and drink packaging market, specifically in Europe. This is obviously covered in the report, but it's great to have this conversation and drill down into it as much as possible. So I suppose to kick us off, why is this topic so interesting and why is it so important to the packaging market?
I think the main reason can be summed up in one word, and that is sustainability. It's been a major market driver, if not the most important market driver in the packaging industry for quite some time now. It's continued to advance up the agenda. And even though I think the interesting thing is that sustainability covers so many things. I mean, the report, for example, talks about recycling, use of recycled material, the use of alternative materials such as bioplastics. And also it covers the trend now, which is moving in favor of kind of like reuse and refillable packaging. So the debate, I think, is really moving to how can we actually kind of like reduce the amount of packaging which is coming into the world, which then sort of like bypasses that whole issue of kind of like recycling and compostability, issues like that. It's just looking to sort of like use less packaging per se. That did really sort of take a bit of a backseat during the pandemic for obvious reasons, but I think that is now really coming to the fore.
So you'd say that sustainability is obviously the key trend that everyone's focusing on in packaging at the moment, but you're sort of seeing more questions and conversations around reducing the amount of plastic or packaging in general, as opposed to sort of making it more recyclable and more recycling friendly.
Sure, yes. I mean, obviously, recycling, use of recycled material is still very important. What you have to remember, of course, is a lot of this is being driven by regulatory action from the EU. I know the UK is no longer part of the EU, but the broad targets are still the same. You know, the UK is moving in the same direction as the EU. So this is a trend which is apparent throughout the whole of the European region. Yes, and much of the recent legislation which has come out. One obvious example is the Single-Use Plastics Directive, which came into force in 2021. The whole issue is about, trying to take as many single-use plastics as possible out of the kind of like food and drink industry in Europe, switching to sort of like more environmentally friendly or more sustainable options. So that's one thing. And to go back to the whole issue of reuse and refillable packaging, the EU is also considering introducing some proposed targets for 2030 and 2040 in sectors like takeaway containers, industrial packaging, e-commerce packaging, which of course e-commerce has been a huge growth industry accelerated by the pandemic. But one of the consequences of the e-commerce industry growth is that there's a corresponding increase in the amount of packaging which has come onto the market. So all these things are sort of like leading the EU to kind of like consider introducing some targets for like a percentage of all the packaging used in that sector falling into the sort of like refill, reuse sort of category.
Absolutely. So recently the EU voted on the use of reusable packaging and sort of the impact that that would have on the packaging industry. How have you seen that affecting food and drink packaging?
I think it is quite interesting because most of the major brand owners, the major companies, the food retailers have all been kind of like introducing their own targets, irrespective of kind of like what the regulatory bodies have been doing. Just to go back to reusable, refillable packaging. I mean, Coca-Cola is a good example of that. That has actually set a target for the future on how much of its drinks will be sort of like packaged in kind of like refillable bottles. They've also been exploring various kind of like schemes along the lines of how we used to have milk delivered, where you would kind of like return the bottles to the dairy, put them on your doorstep for collection. They've been investigating kind of like a similar scheme for some of their major brands like Coca-Cola. I think Coke Zero is kind of like in on this as well. So, like I said, to go back to the question, I think it's interesting because although in a way companies are having to do this because of the regulatory action, they also know they have to do this just because of pressure from consumers. All the consumer studies that you see, most of them will say that consumers are broadly in favour of using less packaging, of using more environmentally friendly packaging, using more sustainable packaging. In some instances, people are even claim they'll pay a premium for kind of like packaging which is kinder to the environment.
I think that's the interesting discussion at the moment, how consumers are approaching packaging. Does sustainability win or does convenience win? I think that's a very interesting debate amongst the packaging industry. Where do you fall on that?
I think most people, most consumers do sort of like want to do the right thing, which is why we're seeing these kind of like results in all these consumer surveys. But I'd probably add a couple of caveats to that. Firstly, I mean, what you say you would like to do and what you do are not always the same thing. I've been in market research long enough to kind of like know that. And what you have to also consider is that as far as packaging is concerned, kind of like environmental considerations are kind of like just one factor in the whole kind of like consumer purchasing process. Even though consumers would like to recycle as much packaging as they want, I mean, if it's not easy for them to do so, if their local authority won't collect it, or they haven't got the recycling facilities to hand, then maybe it will slip down the agenda a bit. If the packaging offers another attribute such as convenience, for instance. I mean, convenience is a very, very big consumer driver. And to go back to the whole refillable, reusable packaging, we saw during the pandemic that all the efforts that were being made by food retailers like Waitrose to sort of like have more products like dried foods, like coffee, in things that consumers could fill their own containers. Well, of course, the whole issue of hygiene, transmission of the virus started playing on consumers' minds. And unfortunately, from an environmental perspective, that increased the appeal of kind of like single-use packaging. So you knew you were safe. You just handle it and then get rid of it, and that would sort of like minimize transmission of the virus. So it's balancing that whole environmental consideration against the other sort of attributes that packaging has. Of course, safety is another one. We're seeing more disposable items in food service, for example, which are made from products like wood and bamboo. But there is the feeling that more research needs to be done for some of these materials to ensure that they're kind of like as safe as can be expected from that whole food contact safety perspective.
Absolutely. I think that leads us quite nicely into my next question. What are the sort of the key technological innovations that we're seeing in this sphere, in this industry at the moment?
Um, well, QR codes are used quite extensively within the food and drink packaging industry in Europe. I think that trend is going to continue. They're looking at developing now more advanced QR codes to protect against counterfeit activity. And of course, QR codes offer all sorts of advantages, from like track and trace in the supply chain to like brand authentication, with pretty much smartphone penetration now not
Mhm.
quite universal, but very, very high amongst the European population. It's very easy now for people, for consumers, to sort of like use their smartphones to access QR codes to take part in promotional campaigns and competitions, things like that. So QR codes is one of the big technological innovations. RFID,
Mhm.
radio frequency identification. I think that's becoming more and more important, certainly in the supply chain. Uh, Unfortunately, counterfeit brand activity does tend to be quite high in parts of the European food and drink industry, and obviously it's in the interests of brand owners to ensure that they're not being ripped off by counterfeiters. And looking a bit further into the future, augmented reality is being mooted as a possible innovation for the future that will be more widespread in the industry. Part of that whole sort of like creating a deeper engagement, if you like, with customers to get more sort of like real time data, maybe even adding artificial intelligence
Mhm.
algorithms to get insights into sort of like how consumers behave, what brands they favor, what attracts them to certain products, that sort of thing.
Thank you very much. So I suppose now, if we turn to the market specifically, European food and drink packaging, what are the areas that are growing the fastest in the industry, or the most in the industry?
Well, from an end user perspective, I think if you look at some of the categories like frozen foods is doing quite well. I think they're seen as quite a sort of like affordable and convenient by consumers. And the industry has done a lot to sort of like improve the perceived quality of many frozen foods. So
Mhm.
that's doing well. Any products really that have that can be promoted from some sort of like health angle. I mean, bottled water, for instance, and like fruit juices and drinks, they're seen as kind of like healthier alternatives, if you like, to some of the carbonated drinks and alcohol. So I think they're performing quite well. Um, Fruit and vegetables is another one which is there'll always be sort of like a steady demand for,
Mhm.
and ditto products like dairy products, bakery products. Now consumers are kind of like working in the office a bit more and commuting a bit more. That's kind of like kick-started the market for sort of like food to go as well.
Mhm.
In which case, you've got sort of like products like bakery items that people can eat on the way to the office, hot drinks like tea and coffee. So I think demand is going to sort of keep fairly constant in those areas, if not actually grow.
Mhm.
And in terms of packaging material, I think obviously plastic does, the various plastic products do face a bit of a challenge with
Mhm.
the regulatory action and just the general bad press plastic tends to sort of like attract for better or for worse. And for that reason, I think some of the paper based uh, packaging products will probably do quite well over the next few years.
Mhm.
Paper, of course, the recycling rate in Europe for paper is quite high. So again, that helps with its kind of like sustainability appeal, if you like. And metal and glass, again, recycling rates are sort of quite high in those sectors. Metal, of course, can be recycled, almost infinitely without any perceived drop in quality levels. So I think, and canned foods, I've heard are doing quite well as well. They're seen as quite affordable, for consumers who may be looking to cut back a bit on their household bills. And so metal should perform reasonably well over the next few years as well.
What areas are struggling in the market? Where are we seeing the numbers not quite growing as quickly as they have done previously?
Well, again, to go back to packaging material, lots of the plastic categories, if you look at the products which are no longer coming onto the market in the EU, especially in food service, like plastic lids, plastic plates, plastic utensils, I think they're going to face a very, very tough future. I think that they're going to need to really look at some sort of alternative, more environmentally friendly materials that are possibly biodegradable or compostable or more readily recyclable, really, to sort of like avoid seeing a huge drop in demand. And in terms of products, I would say obviously meat and fish is quite an interesting area because we have seen more and more people gravitating towards vegetarianism, veganism, flexitarians, which are people who are still eating meat but just looking to sort of cut down on their consumption. I've seen a lot of forecasts in the past during my time in the food industry that have kind of like predicted almost kind of like the end of the meat industry. But I do think these are sort of slightly exaggerated. I think people will still, most people will still continue to eat meat and fish, if on perhaps a less frequent basis. So I think that both of those sectors have got a bit of a challenge to, to ensure that doesn't happen. And similarly, for other products, which, shall we say, are not usually considered particularly healthy, confectionery springs to mind. Snacks such as crisps is another good example. What I think with those is happening is that consumers are sort of perhaps buying these products a bit less frequently, but when they do buy them, they want something that's sort of like going to offer them a bit of a treat, something as a bit of an indulgence or, affordable luxury. And similarly for alcoholic drinks as well, beer and wine. I think there's sort of that there is the feeling that, from certain organizations that people need to be sort of like drinking less. So whether that does sort of like translate into any sort of like long-term declines in the consumption of drinks, I'm not too sure they're going to see any huge drop in demand. I think people can still continue to sort of like drink alcohol, but perhaps with the sort of economy being in the state it's in, people will be drinking more at home rather than kind of like going out to pubs and clubs and hotels. And obviously, if that does happen, sort of like over the longer term, that will present opportunities for, packaging manufacturers like glass bottles and metal cans.
And I suppose just to sum us up, so what's the main thing that you want people to know about this report that's included part of the research into the food and drink market?
I think the main takeaway, I would say, from this report is just the fact that the packaging industry is point in time is facing quite a lot of almost sort of unprecedented changes where entire packaging products and disposables are sort of like their use is being restricted. And it's really how the industry responds to that, whether it's sort of looks to sort of like invest in new materials or whether, sort of it looks to try and drive some sort of change in consumption habits. and as well, you've also got the technological aspect about how these new technologies such as AR and AI are going to be influencing how brand owners and consumers interact in the future. And packaging will be one of the mechanisms through which this occurs.
Great. Well, thank you ever so much for joining me today, Jonathan. People can
Pleasure.
look out for the report that we publish before the end of the year. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.